So dear all, it's very nice to see so many of you here today. Today is a festive day at BrIAS. This afternoon, the 2026 opening ceremony will take place. And we are also extremely happy and honored to welcome today a special guest for our weekly research seminar, Professor Natasha Wunsch. Welcome. Professor Wunsch is a professor for European Studies and director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. And her research interests intersect or lie at the intersection between European politics and comparative politics, with a specific focus on democratization and democratic backsliding. And today she will present her very new book that focuses on democratic commitments, Why Citizens Tolerate Democratic Backsliding, which was published last year with Oxford University Press. So Professor Wunsch will first give a presentation of around 40-45 minutes. Then afterwards, her work will be discussed by Professor Luca Tomini, who is here in the first row, who is a FNRS associate, research associate, and professor of political science at the ULB. And then afterwards, there's of course plenty of time for a Q&A. So enjoy, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Thank you very much to all of the BrIAS community for inviting me here, for having me for this book launch. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share this recently published book with you. As Silvia mentioned, it's just out with Oxford University Press, and also thanks to generous support by the Swiss National Science Foundation, it's actually out open access, so you can find all of the chapters free for download on the OUP website. And so what I do in this book is I address a puzzle that I find quite central to contemporary politics, which is that we have, on the one hand, this idea that citizens are broadly, and according to cross-national survey evidence, committed to democracy. At least this is what they declare. And at the same time, we've seen in the past decade and a little more, not only the arrival in power of elected leaders that start dismantling democracy, but that these leaders are frequently confirmed in power, as has been the case in Hungary, for instance, or even returned to power, as has been the case in the United States, and this despite having shown their true colors while in office and having shown their undemocratic intentions. And so the question that I address in this book is really to ask, why is it that citizens tolerate these kinds of behavior and tolerate these processes of gradual, incipient, and kind of ongoing democratic backsliding over time? There are two prominent explanations of this phenomenon out there already, to which I add a third. The first focuses very much on the role of partisanship and partisan loyalty, and it's a thesis that was developed in the American context, so in the very bipolar Republican Democrat context that shapes American politics, and that really argues that while citizens may recognize what is going on, they actually value partisanship and partisan loyalty above an elected leader's respect for democracy. And this leads them then to tolerate these transgressions, although they see the cost. The second big hypothesis focuses on trade-offs. So again, with the kind of implicit assumption, citizens recognize what is going on, but they will prioritize something else more highly than a leader's respect for democracy. And that can be economic preferences, this can be cultural orientations, also with the ongoing cultural divides that shape a lot of contemporary electoral competition. And I add to this a third understanding where I say, well, perhaps we're overestimating actually the extent to which citizens are really able to systematically recognize these transgressions that are going on, because we may actually have divergent understandings of democracy within the same population, and therefore a lack of consolidation around the liberal democratic principles that are typically those that are attacked in processes of backsliding, because simply the transgressions that are occurring don't strike at least certain citizens as being violations of democracy per se, or not violations of their understanding of democracy. And so this argument ties into a very long established literature on political culture, the role of support for democracy that is seen as central both to democratic stability and also to democratic consolidation. And we also have quite some research by the World Values Survey crowd that suggests that at the aggregate level, support for democracy and regime type correlate. So you kind of have a convergence between political culture and support for democracy and regime type. At the same time, there's another literature that looks into the persistence of divergent understandings of democracy often within with a very case-focused attention, and more with an exploratory take that develops typologies within distinct settings. But these are, of course, these bodies of literature remain somewhat divided. And more generally, what remains unclear is how democratic attitudes at the individual level may relate to political behavior. And this is what I tackle in the book. And so the theoretical argument that I make is that we have understandings of democracy, that these are heterogeneous, and that these heterogeneous understandings of democracy within a given population map onto different degrees of democratic commitment, and specifically to commitment to liberal democratic norms, and that this in turn shapes vote choice in these contexts of democratic backsliding. The argument comes with a demand side and a supply side. So on the demand side, I expect citizens to have some extent of pre-existing beliefs, not necessarily a full-fledged idea of democracy, because it's not something that ordinary citizens think about all day long. And therefore, on the supply side, I think there's also a role played by political elites in shaping and in discursively activating these alternative understandings by lending them legitimacy. So I proceed in my theoretical argument in three steps. On the demand side, I expect commitment to liberal democracy to remain uneven among citizens, and for this to make part of the electorate either vulnerable to trade-offs in the form of economic payouts, social welfare benefits, and other, but also to majoritarian or illiberal appeals by political elites who seek to present democracy as something other than liberal democracy. On the supply side, then, I'm interested in seeing to what extent this deliberate form of mobilization of alternative understandings is happening, and with this idea that elites might intentionally seek to reframe democracy in order to ensure ongoing electoral support despite engaging in democratic transgressions. And then bringing the two together, the overarching hypothesis that I probe in the book is that citizens with a lower commitment to liberal democratic norms are going to be more likely to tolerate democratic transgressions by elected leaders. And then in turn, those that are more committed to liberal democracy should be those that prioritize this more in their electoral decisions. Now, in the book, I focus on the two most prominent cases of democratic backsliding in Europe. Viktor Orban, Fidesz in Hungary, is in its fourth consecutive mandate. They're vying for a fifth consecutive mandate in the April elections. For now, the polls are actually not looking too good, but it wouldn't have been the first time that the polls don't look good, and somehow Orban makes the results look more in his favor than might have been expected. So this will be something interesting to look out for this spring. And then the other case is Poland, where, of course, the situation is different because there has been electoral turnover with the parliamentary elections in October 23. But I will also say the data collection that happened for this book was during, while backsliding was still going on in both cases. So the first question to ask is, how would we measure democratic commitment, right? Because I basically say what we have for now, in terms of cross-national evidence, is not sufficient. Most of the cross-national surveys we have tend to measure nominal support for democracy. So we have, for instance, in the World Values Survey, we have a battery included that has basically the Churchillian question to what do you think about democracy, what do you think about technocrats in power, what do you think about army rule. So it's basically alternatives, but kind of the blatantly obvious alternative that you would go for as a regular European survey respondent is democracy, yielding to a very skewed distribution that would suggest citizens broadly support democracy in most contexts. The European Social Survey has a question where they ask how important is it for you to live in a democracy, scored from 0 to 10. But then the developers of this measure actually say that empirically, when you look at it, to make sense of this measure, you actually need to dichotomize it at a cutoff of 10. So you're either 10 out of 10 Democrat, or you're anything between 0 and 9, which means that you lose quite a bit of nuance. And the ESS also has a battery of liberal items, as does a recently published piece by Chris Claassen and co-authors. But there, the idea is also that you're very much probing support for liberal democratic items in isolation. And if that's all you're asked about, then be it qua socialization or social desirability, you are going to say that democracy sounds pretty good and you're in support. So what we end up with this existing evidence is often very little cross-national variation, although on the other hand, we have, of course, pretty significant variation when it comes to the quality of democracy. And so what I propose in the book is a composite measure of democratic commitment, where I ask respondents both about liberal items, but also about alternative understandings of democracy side by side. And then I use latent profile analysis to build 5 different groups of understandings of democracy that score kind of across these 4 dimensions that I'll share with you now. The first dimension is the very classical liberal democratic conception of democracy and emphasis on equal rights, minority rights, executive constraints. I add to that a redistributive dimension, so a more outcome-oriented one, where the idea is that democracy is about delivering public goods, delivering social welfare benefits, and making citizens' lives more enjoyable, which is, of course, conceptually somewhat compatible with the procedural emphasis of liberal democracy, but still a different kind of emphasis. I also offer citizens items that emphasize a majoritarian understanding of democracy, and here majoritarian not in the idea of a simple emphasis on majority rule, which is of course the basic premise of democracy at large, but really this idea that majority rule primes over minority rights, and once a government holds electoral office and has the backing of the electoral majority, then they should have pretty much unlimited leeway to implement their program. And then I have a 4th dimension that I add, which is an authoritarian understanding of democracy, where respondents will declare that they're in favor of democracy, but then when you ask them what exactly this is about, they'll emphasize strong leadership, citizen obedience, and things that we would not typically associate with liberal democracy. So I have respondents score across these 4 dimensions, and then I build these 5 different groups. We have the 5 same groups in Poland and Hungary. And so what you see here is the first group, those that I qualify as strong liberals, which is typically, I would say, the way we think about widespread mass support for democracy. So you have a very high level of support for liberal democracy in both cases. You have a reasonably high support for the redistributive dimension. As I said, that's not in direct contradiction with the procedural prerequisites of liberal democracy. And then you have low scores for majoritarian and authoritarian. But this is only a very small share of the sample in each of the cases. It's 12% in Hungary, 13% in Poland, so certainly not enough to really push back against backsliding leaders. We have a much larger group of weak liberals. So here we also have, as we know from cross-national surveys, high scores on the liberal dimension, also high on the redistributive, but also high on the majoritarian. So here we're starting to see a bit of a tension between either you have an unconstrained majority or you have liberal constraints on executive power. They're not exactly compatible. They're still low on authoritarian. We have a 3rd group, again with very high scores on the liberal dimension, but also similarly high across the board. So basically these respondents are telling us, and the question is, to what extent do you think the following are essential for democracy? Kind of everything is essential, even if conceptually it's sometimes in contradiction. So this is why I call them ambivalent Democrats. We have a 4th group. Again, you see from the data cloud, there's a lot of these people in different respondents. So we see here for the first time a real drop in the average score for the liberal dimension. So we're much closer to the midpoint of the scale. And we also see that while there is a lot of noise on the other dimensions, the average is again on the midpoint. So these are really respondents that are saying either I don't understand the question, or I don't really care, or I've kind of given up on democracy because there's a lot of things going on and I'm not too happy about this. I'll say more about these respondents later. And then we have a final group where we have actually really low and very consistently low scores also on this liberal dimension. And the highest dimension is for the authoritarian, the highest scores for the authoritarian dimension. Now, when we look at the distribution of these, while the 5 groups are the same, the distribution is actually quite different across the 2 countries. In Hungary, you really have well over 50% that are considered weak liberals. So those are somewhat, of course, committed to the liberal dimension, but also very much interested in trade-offs, in redistribution, and also very open to majoritarian arguments. And in Poland, we also have a relatively large group, around a third of the sample, that are classified as weak liberals. We also have a very large group of indifferent respondents that are somewhat disengaged, disenchanted. So because, of course, I can't look into survey respondents' heads, I try to get at this in a different way by using focus groups with ordinary citizens in both countries. So they were, ordinary citizens were defined as having a mid-level education, mid-level income, a reasonable degree of political interest so that there would be some discussion. And then the groups were mixed gender, mixed ideology, opposition and governing party support, and they were held both in the capitals and then in more rural areas. They were conducted by professional moderators in the local language and revolved around 4 broad questions that were discussed in the groups. What does democracy mean to you? How do you evaluate the state of democracy in your own country at the moment? Which role do you see for a leader in a democracy, and which role do you see for citizens in a democracy? And what was interesting in the Hungarian case is that in the abstract, participants actually were able to articulate pretty clearly what democracy is and actually what liberal democracy is, but there was a big gap between this theoretical ideal and then their ability to also say, but what is happening in the country today is quite problematic. In the case of the government supporters, they also recognized some of the shortcomings, but they expressed indifference. So a lot of times the citizen discussions would focus on elections. And here I brought you a quote from a Fidesz respondent who said, "In Hungary, there is no multi-party system. There are many small parties that are trying to run. The press is under the influence of the government. Everything that should not be in a democracy is in the hands of the government." So very clear evaluation. But it's not necessarily bad. It's just not a democracy. Of course, the opposition supporters had a slightly different take on this and would be a little bit more frustrated. Here we're also speaking about the multi-party system, so again, same assessment. The multi-party system is already missing to start off with. We have a party that rules in governance. There is no option to choose someone else. And many people actually don't go to vote because they say none of all of these parties are better than the others. People don't feel that things that happen in this country are in their own interest. So here we see much more of this kind of disengagement. Democracy is failing at large. This is not just about the backsliding government. This is about a failure of democracy. And this apathy and this disillusionment was really widespread. It was actually kind of depressing to read the transcripts from the focus group. Here we have, again, a government supporter saying, and there was a big discussion about emigration, basically saying, if you're not happy, should you emigrate? Which is, of course, what a lot of liberal-minded, well-educated Hungarians have chosen to do over the past 10, 15 years. And so this lady tells us, I always feel that if someone is living in Hungary, so if you choose to stay and not to emigrate, then obviously we cannot fully influence things, so we need to accept what we have. As we live here, we cannot do a lot besides going to vote every 4 years. What else can we do? There was also this really pervasive sense that citizens' involvement stops at the ballot box. You go, you vote, and then you sit it out for the next 4 years. If we live here, this means we have to accept what we have. Then we had somewhat like even more passive views. Here, a young man that is a supporter of the opposition, who told us that citizens' role in democracy is basically to maintain the stability in the country, for example, by paying taxes and working. So this was literally the first answer to the question, which role do citizens play in a democracy? Which is, you would kind of hope for a teeny tiny little bit more participatory dimension. And then in a slightly more abstract take, but on the same logic, this feeling that somehow people in Hungary don't really know what to do with a democracy. So this is also something that came up in both countries. In Poland, it was a little bit different because there was a strong majoritarian conception already in the abstract. So what does democracy mean to you? A lot of times it would come, so it's the majority. Once the majority is in power, they do what they want. And especially the governing party supporters were what I qualify as defensive majoritarians. So here we have a young male supporter of the Law and Justice Party, PiS, who said, we have elections in Poland to choose the government we want, and then unfortunately you need to be a Democrat. You have to accept things, and if you want to change things, choose another option. Again, this idea of deferred activism. You must vote again, but of course in 4 years' time. And then an older participant from outside, so from Lublin, which is a PiS stronghold, the recognition here, democracy is different from liberal democracy. It's also different from popular democracy. But as regards this kind of overarching democracy itself, the situation in Poland is not too bad. And there are countries in Europe west of Poland. So we're not talking Belarus, we're talking Germany, France, whatever country this person had in mind, where the situation is much worse. The opposition supporters were also frequently majoritarian, as were some of the older PiS voters, but more in a resigned sense. So here we had a young woman saying, in a democracy, the majority wins, the majority makes a decision, and we must submit to it, and it also means submitting to those who won in the elections. And then also mirroring this sense of disempowerment from the Hungarian groups, our influence finishes with the end of the elections, and then they can do what they want, even if the minority is right. Unfortunately, in a democracy, those who are in the majority decide, even if they are wrong. And as citizens, we can do nothing about this. In Poland, there was also quite a strong awareness that peace was actually eroding democracy over time, but that this was seen as from a perspective of real citizen disempowerment. So here we have an older lady that's a supporter of the opposition party saying, in Poland, the system is based on the same, the parliament, the Senate and the president, 3 stages, now peace has them all. And I don't know whether it's a democracy, because the other side has no chance to exert any influence because everything is in one hand. And then again, another female respondent, I don't feel I can influence anything, even if I participate in elections, and I always do. So these are not non-voters, but I don't influence anything. I don't feel like I have any influence whatsoever. So what we see when we dig a little bit deeper into how these citizens on the ground feel about the situation, there is actually a relatively clear ability to recognize that democratic transgressions are ongoing, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a willingness to resist those, either at the ballot box or much less so in the street. I had questions about protests. They fell flat completely. Protests, it's senseless, meaningless, it's dangerous, it doesn't change anything. They were not in favor. The government supporters generally tried to shift blame or to relativize, so there were also frequent comparisons with communism. Well, but under communism it was much worse, so what are people complaining about today? And they would often focus on economic benefits. So Fidesz or PiS, they gave us housing credits, they gave us childcare. Who needs independent judges if you have a reasonably filled account at the end of the month? While the opposition supporters, rather than targeting their ire and wrath kind of directly at the governing party, would express a general loss of trust in the political system as a whole and withdraw. In Poland especially, we had this strong majoritarian view, as I said, also among opposition supporters. But really what was most striking from these focus groups was this very passive view of the role that citizens played in democracy and this widespread withdrawal from politics. So on the demand side, clearly quite a bit of heterogeneity when it comes to understandings of democracy, and also a sense that as citizens, there's not so much you can do to respond immediately to backsliding. Now, what does the situation look like on the supply side? Here I looked into, in particular, backsliding elites and how they frame democracy. I had a data corpus collected by 2 native language research assistants that went through the statements that PiS and Fidesz leaders had made about democracy. There was actually an interesting difference in how these 2 data sets were compiled. In Hungary, basically anything Viktor Orban has ever said is compiled on the website of the Prime Minister's office, in Hungarian, in German, and in English, with, interestingly, the German and English versions apparently being a little bit more moderate than the Hungarian ones, so they're targeted at an international audience. Whereas in Poland, there exists no kind of equivalent, so the RA had to painstakingly comb through media articles to draw out individual statements that these leaders would make about democracy. Both actually really complained about feeling very brainwashed after this exercise, so something that I had not anticipated for the ethics approval process. And so because the corpora were so different, I couldn't really engage analyze them meaningfully in a quantitative way, and I conducted a qualitative frame analysis. So it was basically looking whether the different understandings of democracy that I had probed on the demand side among citizens, whether they were mirrored in elite discourse, be it redistributive appeals, anything related to distribution, welfare, and so on, majoritarian appeals, not just about majority rule per se, but also in these 2 cases about sovereignty, because of course there was a lot of pushback against external interference by Brussels, by the EU. And then outright illiberal appeals related to political stability, alternative set of values. The first thing I did was I drew on the V-Party index to look into the evolution of the degree of anti-pluralism in different parties' discourse over time. And what's very interesting is we often perceive these party systems to be relatively polarized. But then when it comes to at least anti-pluralism, this is about perceiving the opposition as legitimate, granting the opposition the right to at least debate about legislative projects in parliament and so on. It's not so much a polarization as a radicalization of Fidesz over time. So you really see, even before they arrive in office, so between 2006 and 2010, they were not in office. Every mandate, every electoral point, the discourse becomes more anti-pluralist, so much so that they also overtake the far-right Jobbik on the right, which was quite an achievement at the time because they become more moderate and Fidesz is kind of right up there. And then when we look at this discourse qualitatively, we see that the vast majority is really focused on this values dimension and really articulating, of course, in the case of Fidesz, and this is something that a lot of Western European media have reported on too, this idea of illiberal democracy as an alternative project. Some on sovereignty too, but really this emphasis. And it's quite interesting when you go through this discourse to really see just how articulate and how sophisticated it is, with very long historical references, philosophical references. It sounds reasonably compelling until you start thinking a little bit about what he's saying, but at least it's very coherent. So here I just drew out one particularly telling quote by Orban from 2019, where he says, "Let us confidently declare that Christian democracy is not liberal." And of course, with all of the pushback against illiberal democracy, he reframed it as Christian democracy. It's still the same idea, and probably not much to the liking of the Christian democratic parties that we have in many other countries. But he says, so liberal democracy is in favor of multiculturalism, while Christian democracy gives priority to Christian culture. This is an illiberal concept. Liberal democracy is pro-immigration, while Christian democracy is anti-immigration. That's again genuinely liberal. And liberal democracy sides with adaptable family models, while Christian democracy rests on the foundations of the Christian family model, once more, definitely illiberal. And so a very avowedly alternative discourse to what democracy actually is. And one that he's been saying so much that I can actually, and this of course my RA based in Switzerland was not exactly an Orban fan before she started, but she really said, you read this and at one point you really are brainwashed because it does sound coherent. And it does sound like the Western liberal model is something out there and it's not compatible with Hungarian values. Another thing that was emphasized a lot was the importance of political stability and strong leadership, so resonating a bit with these authoritarian understandings of democracy, where Orban from the start had this idea, if ever the opposition won, this would destabilize the country. And this is, of course, something that you can mobilize to scare voters, often tied to economic growth. And unlike Poland, the economic situation in Hungary didn't develop as favorably, so there was something that needed to be said why Orban still needed to remain in power, although the economy isn't performing well. So he said there are periods in which no successful economic policy can be conceived without firm, clear political leadership. At times like this, we need charismatic leaders, strong leaders, political stability. We also need a robust parliamentary majority. He actually had a 2/3 majority for most of his rule, in order to have the power to enforce an economic policy based on new approaches. And he also had this vision, which is also quite striking when you think he's actually on the verge of achieving it, depending on how things turn out in April, where he said, when I swore the prime ministerial oath 1 week ago, I said that I see the 20 years between 2010 and 2030 as a single period, and that when in 2010 the will of the electorate enabled us to return to government, I also saw them as one unit and not as divided into 4-year terms. So something that doesn't really resonate much with the idea that democracy often implies turnover, at least some degree of competition. He really had this 20-year vision that he needs to remain in power for these 20 years to implement. Now, when we look at the Polish case, first of all, when it comes to anti-pluralism, a pretty similar picture to Hungary, a little bit less dramatic, but clearly a radicalization of peace, anti-pluralist discourse over time, whereas the opposition parties remain, or the more leftist parties remain pretty neutral. When we look at the content of the discourse, it's actually much more diverse. So we also have a lot about values, but we also have a lot of pushback. And of course, the EU was somewhat more vocal earlier on against Poland because they saw that they somehow missed the window for Hungary early on. There's quite a bit also about development. Because one of the big appeals by PiS was this idea of the good change. So there were the true Poles, and they had been not favored by the previous liberal government, and now they needed to be kind of taken out of their left-behind state and picked up. So here we have the prime minister at the time saying, law and justice is a formation whose philosophy is to improve the lives of ordinary people, and this is the true essence of democracy. So never mind all of these liberal constraints, niceties, media freedom, and so on. What we need is this revolution of dignity, so this is reaching out to the left behind, and that's what we're implementing. And then again, this direct appeal to democracy, our economic policy is more democratic. And why is it more democratic? Because it's addressed to broad social groups, and thus it's more just and more equal. And so democracy, again, here in a redistributive sense. The next few weeks will decide decades. This is ahead of the October 2019 elections, where PiS gained a second mandate. And we want to engage what is most important, building a standard of living like those of the Western countries. There's a lot of references to the West, the neighbors, and catching up. In a decade or two, so later on, in a more of a sequential logic, we will live much better and we'll have much more freedom. But the freedom for now is not the emphasis. The emphasis for now is on building that better standard of living. And we also have in Poland the mirror image of these strong majoritarian conceptions among citizens that are also really articulated quite vocally by political leaders. Here we have Kaczynski, so kind of the shadow figure behind everyone, who says, the sad truth about our ideological and political opponents from both sides of the border, domestic opposition and kind of EU criticism at the same time, is that they believe democracy is only when they hold power. But when in free elections someone else wins, then by definition we're dealing with the end of democracy, or at least a deadly threat. So this idea that any kind of criticism is basically ideologically biased, there's a partisan bias, it's just because the friends of the EU didn't win and suddenly they make a whole fuss about democracy being taken apart. And then he concedes in a speech 3 years later, he says, I can say that Polish democracy is defective, but this is because we lack an opposition of a normal character. They, the opposition, have to accept the results of the election, and they have to fight for victory in the next ones. So again, this idea, wait it out, you have another 4 years, and then you get your chance, and not question the right to rule by those who won and have the majority, and therefore should be allowed to rule unconstrained. So while I didn't engage in kind of a causal argument where I put the supply and demand side together, you definitely see that there is a resonance between what citizens express they think about democracy and the way backsliding elites frame what democracy should be. And both Hungarian and Polish leaders seek to reframe democracy essentially along two main lines. On the one hand, the failure of liberal democracy to deliver on outcomes, be they in the form of economic prosperity, but also often related to the protection of traditional values. So you don't want these liberal progressive values coming in that doesn't resonate with the realities on the ground. But also the other kind of argument that liberal democracy has a limited input legitimacy because of its counter-majoritarian elements that basically prevent the elected majority from implementing its program. I found, somewhat to my surprise, relatively few direct justifications of democratic transgression, so I thought that they would maybe say, yes, we nominated the judges unconstitutionally, but we did so for the following reason. And instead, they really sidestep these issues completely and try to construct a strong voter base on the base around an alternative set of values that would withstand both external and domestic criticism. So also on the supply side, clear evidence for these alternative understandings of democracy as being one of the main electoral appeals also made in these contexts of ongoing erosion. Now, bringing the supply and demand side together, I conducted two conjoint experiments, one in the Polish context, one in the Hungarian one, that included candidates that would speak about democracy, but would also express some kind of a cultural orientation and an economic orientation. In the Polish case, we also had partisanship. I'll say something about that in a moment. In the Hungarian one, we decided to exclude it. The candidates also had an age and a gender to make them feel a bit more real, but that didn't matter to voting decisions. So in the Hungarian case, the idea was always that the democratic attributes would be manipulated in a way to correspond to the different understandings of democracy that I had probed previously among the citizens. So here we had a so-called democratic priority item, so a bit of a high level, this is what I think democracy should be about. In a liberal sense, ensuring equal rights. In a more outcome-orientated sense, improving living conditions. And in a majoritarian sense, implementing the will of the majority. And then for judicial independence, it was about how the judges might interfere in legislation or not interfere, because that would be not considered democratic. And if we look here at the findings, we see, so right at the top, we have the two democratic items. Those are the ones where the effect sizes are the largest. So each time respondents would see two different profiles and would be forced to choose which of these two candidates would they choose, and they'd vary along these different dimensions. And then these dots always indicate everything else held equal, how much of a difference did this element make? And we see that the biggest difference is here at the level of the judges, where liberal items are strongly prioritized on average, and the authoritarian ones are strongly punished. The majoritarian ones, of course, are conceptually in the middle, so they kind of come out in the middle. But then the bigger question is, of course, do the understandings that citizens hold of democracy, do they make a difference in how they score in these conjoint experiments? And so here I plug in the subgroups, so the 5 groups that I showed you before based on the latent profile analysis. And you see that the red dots, so the strong liberals, for this judicial independence item, clearly confirm the main hypothesis that I formulate in the book, that those that hold these very strong liberal convictions are those that will systematically, in a multidimensional voting setup, prioritize candidates who have strong liberal views and punish candidates who have strongly authoritarian views. It didn't come out in that way for this democratic priority item, which we explained with the fact that maybe it was a bit too high level, so it's rare that politicians speak in this big picture of democracy is about the majority rule. And we also see that the understandings of democracy didn't matter for any of the other items. So it's really about how this works as a filter, this commitment to democracy in prioritizing or not, as you see with the other groups here, the democratic commitment of a candidate. Now, of course, the alternative explanation would be this is a question of partisanship. So I looked into this too. You have the red dots here are Fidesz. So we see that for the democratic items, for the judicial independence, Fidesz supporters are a little bit less likely to reward liberal items, a little bit less likely to punish authoritarian ones, but not significantly so. The one big significant difference between Fidesz and actually all other parties is along the cultural dimension. So it's a really question of cultural polarization. Fidesz supporters strongly punished candidates who expressed openness to new cultural influence and strongly rewarded candidates who said traditional culture needed to be protected. Now, if we turn to the Polish side, here we actually had 2 more liberal democratic elements, judicial appointments again, but also the role of public media, again formulating the 3 different ways in which candidates might think about these. And when we look at the overarching results, we see that there's actually a lot going on. So a lot of these attributes play a role in candidate choice. Also, for instance, shared partisanship seems to play a big role, but I'll say a little bit more about this later. When we look at this from the perspective of the different groups of understandings of democracy, though, we have the same finding that we have in Hungary. So we again have very strong reward by the red strong liberals, and then it basically declines in the order of relative prioritization of liberal items. Punishment of here the majoritarian one, here more the authoritarian one. And we have a bit of a difference here also based on the understandings according to abortion, which is, of course, closely tied to the liberal democratic items. So the strong liberals strongly favor, of course, further liberalizing this and are against restricting it. In Poland, is it maybe a question of partisanship? Here we see that some of the peace findings are actually significant. So Fidesz voters are less likely to reward liberal positions, are a little bit more likely to overlook majoritarian violations or not punish them as strongly. And we also see that here partisanship aligns with this cultural divide that we already saw in Hungary. So in this case, it's PiS and the far-right Confederation Party, strongly Catholic party, that are on the one side of the divide saying we do not want to further liberalize abortion, and we are in favor of candidates who want to restrict it, and then the leftist parties that are all the way over on the other side. But if we look at the subsets of the choices, because you always had 2 choices, so you might end up with 2 PiS or 1 PiS and 1 opposition, or 2 opposition. So if we kind of narrow this down, these are the overall findings here on the left panel. For the middle panel, we have no partisan overlap, so this is not about your party, and here we have partisan overlap. And we actually see, just from comparing the position of the dots, there is no massive benefit in, so it's not about prioritizing partisan loyalty here. It really is more about a different story. And we dug into this a little bit deeper too. While PiS voters were somewhat more likely to stick to their party, leftist voters were more likely to defect to another leftist party if their candidate engaged in democratic transgressions. The final question we asked ourselves is maybe this is about majoritarian conceptions aligning with the incumbent, because of course if your party's in power, then it's more interesting to get rid of executive constraints. And here we found a panel survey that had been conducted in Poland by other colleagues that had one item that basically resembled our emphasis on majoritarian conceptions. Democracy means minority yields to majority. And what we see here is that there's actually quite a bit of development over time, so from 1998 here to 2018. But this development is actually parallel for all the parties. So the red lines are other, the green line is peace, and the blue line is PO. But while they shift, they don't shift in line with incumbency. So here again, it seems that these understandings of democracy are really an independent dimension that shapes vote choice. So to summarize, we see in the book that there is actually considerable heterogeneity in citizens' understandings of democracy, which makes it harder in some cases to recognize and most certainly to resist democratic transgressions by elected leaders. I also find on the supply side that there are explicit elite appeals to alternative understandings of democracy, and that these can lead to a gradual erosion of norms, of course, over time, especially in these polarized contexts where the cost of defecting to another party is perceived as being higher. And so overall, this weak liberal democratic commitment really seems to represent an enduring vulnerability of the political system to democratic subversion. So if we zoom out a little bit, the main argument that I make in the book is to say political culture that is often overlooked in studies of backsliding because it's perceived as something very long-term, very stable, not so easy to shift. But when we look at this through the lens of liberal democratic commitment, it actually does shape political behavior in the form of vote choice in these contexts of backsliding. Now, I'm particularly happy to share this project, not just because I get to promote the book, but because I got a follow-up grant to explore this beyond the context of the two countries where I've done it now. So one thing that I wouldn't want is for this to be read as me as a Western European scholar kind of coming in and saying, oh, those post-communist citizens, they just don't get what democracy is. I actually think that we vastly overestimate mass support for democracy in our context. I think recent shifts in the party landscape and voting results, even in countries that have as their main priority in the country where I'm from, never again, is overestimated. And we need to be very careful in analyzing what is going on there and what we can do against it. So building on three of the main insights from the book, this new project will pursue 3 lines of research. The first being, of course, in the book, I show that there is a substantial difference in the way citizens understand democracy in these very specific contexts, Poland, Hungary, where backsliding is ongoing, democracies were perhaps not as fully consolidated as we thought for a while. So one of the questions I ask, and here the sample of countries is much larger, so we go all the way from Spain to Moldova and from Finland to Italy. How much variation is there in liberal democratic commitment across European democracies? In a bit of a tangential project, together with Teresa Gessler, I worked on the growing salience of what we call a democracy divide, so the idea that incumbent supporters so again, study of Hungary and Poland, are generally less committed to liberal democracy than the competition. But then the question is, how does this variation in citizens' liberal democratic commitment relate to their political identities? And we expect this to be particularly salient, of course, in these contexts of democracy. But how salient is, for instance, democratic attitudes in a context where democracy feels less at risk? Not that there are many of those left, but I guess a few are still around. And then finally, in the book, I show that liberal democratic commitment shapes voter tolerance towards democratic transgressions. But I would like to look in this follow-up project to what extent liberal democratic commitment might shape political behavior more largely, things like protest participation, social media engagement, and other. Thank you very much, and I look forward to Luca's input.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for being here. Thank you very much for the presentation. That was great. This is a brilliant work, actually. She's addressing one of the most pressing questions in contemporary political science, which is basically, why do citizens fail to punish leaders who systematically undermine democratic institutions? I mean, this is pretty topical today, I think. So the core argument is also crystal clear. So it is the lack of consolidation around liberal democratic norms within the population that explain why backsliding leaders can maintain electoral support even if they erode democratic institutions. And this is an important contribution, at least for 5 reasons. So the first reason, the book shows that aggregate measure of democratic support mask deep heterogeneity in how citizens understand democracy. And the multidimensional measurement approach should be also adopted in other research, future research, and extended also to additional countries. Second reason, the book provides systematic evidence that backsliding elites actively appeal to non-liberal dimension, non-liberal understanding of democracy. There is a discourse analysis in chapter 5 that documents very well how Fidesz and PiS in Poland frame the institutional change, reform, legislative reform as democratic rather than non-democratic. So emphasizing other understanding of democracy like majoritarian, egalitarian, and so on. So third, I really like the use of conjunct experiments. In this chapter, she isolates very well the effect of democratic commitment, and I think much more precisely than compared to previous observational studies. The finding, and also there's an interesting finding, a little bit counterintuitive too, that cultural polarization matters more than partisan loyalty. And I'll be back on that because this will probably deserve much more research in the future. The fourth point, there is a nice book, use of triangulation, methodological triangulation in the book. This is very also useful in terms of understanding how to do research, how to approach a very specific topic like that. So she's combining survey data, she's combining discourse analysis, experiments. So overall, this shows very well the value of methodological pluralism. So this is another thing that I very much appreciate in the book. And finally, there is, a focus on citizens. So the book focuses on citizens in the analysis of democratic backsliding. And this, in a way, challenge an elite-focused consensus in the literature on democratic backsliding and autocratization. We will discuss a little bit about the specific mechanism in place, but the broader point here stands. There is democracies cannot be resilient without citizen support. And that we need to understand the forms and the sources of this support. So, in the time I have, I got 5 questions for you, plus 1 bonus at the end. Okay, so I'm starting with the easier one, or maybe not. So first question number 1. Okay, is the weak commitment to liberal democracy the cause of backsliding or just an enabling factor? So at the end of the day, what explains backsliding here? So this is, I think, a crucial question running, through all book theoretical and empirical framework. So you argue that a weak commitment to liberal democracy explains why citizens fail to punish backsliders, okay? But I see a risk here, The risk is to conflate the cause with an enabling factor. So if weak commitment to liberal democracy existed before backsliding began, as you suggest in the chapter, then it cannot be actually the cause of backsliding itself, only kind of permitting or enabling factors that make it possible. You write in one moment that weak commitment to liberal democracy leaves part of the electorate open to authoritarian-leaning leaders who fully seek to legitimize their action with majoritarian appeal or by emphasizing economic benefits and political stability by justifying violating liberal democratic standards. And I think this is a very good description of an enabling, permissive, condition. Weak commitment creates vulnerability in democracy. But then the question remains, what explains the emergence of backsliding in the first place? Why do authoritarian-leaning elites arise at a particular historical moment? Why in Poland and Hungary? And why in the 2010, in that particular period of time? And also in relation to causes, because we are talking about different type of causes, different type of condition, causal condition, you also refer to the literature, the debate on democratic consolidation. I mean, this is also a very good addition to the literature on democratic consolidation, because we can look at backsliding, you know, the other way around, you know, the condition that makes a democracy vulnerable, you know. So it's basically the same debate, another perspective on that. But these works on democratic consolidation explain that consolidated democracy are basically characterized by broad, elite, and mass commitment to democratic norms, and that's good. However, there are many other scholars in this debate that says, be careful, because there are also situations where democracy consolidates, even where there is no such a broad mass commitment to democracy. But the elite act as anchor of democracy. Basically, there are strong intermediate bodies, like especially political parties, trade unions, that make democracy possible, okay? Even in presence of a non-inclusive mass democratic commitment. So in this perspective, the deep cause of lack of consolidation, or in this case backsliding, is not among citizens, but it's always an elite problem. It's always, I mean, this is also all the findings from the debate about interwar backsliding, you know, Nancy Bermeo, Giovanni Capoccia, you know, that was the elite, it was not the citizens, okay? And I will go even further on this argument, because if democratic resilience depends on what you said, the strength and exclusiveness of voter commitment to the liberal dimension of democracy, and if strong liberal Democrats constitute, as you show, only a small minority of the population, basically 12% or 14% of population, the question is, then democratic resilience rests on a tiny fraction of a country, of a population. And one might ask the question, how have democracies survived so far and even consolidated in the first place, if this is the case, you know? If they rely only on this small proportion of strong liberal Democrats, as you define them. Question number 2. That's much more methodological. How confident are you about the robustness of the measurement of your 4 understanding of democracy, your 4 categories? Let's talk in particular about the operationalization of your dimension, okay? And my question also related is, have you tried other alternative operationalization of to test the robustness of this finding? Let's consider the liberal dimension, where you measure this dimension using the 3 world value survey items. So free election, civil right protection, and gender equality. So in principle, and you also agree with that, and I know you are fully aware of this, because you wrote in the text, 2 out of 3 are not indicator of liberal democracy. You mentioned that gender equality item might, and I'm quoting you, might be more appropriately viewed as an outcome rather than an underlying principle of liberal democracy. And free election is usually considered as a measure of the electoral dimension of democracy, not the liberal one. I mean, if we agree with the fact that, you know, by liberal component, liberal dimension of democracy, we consider horizontal accountability, vertical accountability, diagonal accountability, and protection of civil rights. I mean, if we agree on that, then free election is basically the Dalian component of electoral democracy, not the liberal dimension. There's also a question on the majoritarian dimension. You know, you use 2 items that capture some important aspect of majoritarian thinking. But my point is that they might also potentially conflate procedural majoritarianism, like using majority as decision-making process, decision mechanism, with substantive majoritarianism. The belief that majority should face no constraint in any situation. So there's a procedural understanding and a more substantive understanding of majoritarianism that can be maybe conflate here. And And I move to the most maybe problematic for me is how you treat the redistributive dimension, egalitarian dimension of democracy. And you write, this analytical approach rests on the premise that liberal democratic commitment implies not only high levels of support for the liberal dimension of democracy, so high level, but also that this dimension be clearly prioritized over alternative dimension. And my question is, why? Because, you know, I understand that this might be the case when it comes to a liberal understanding of democracy and a very majoritarian understanding. Okay, we say, yeah, we need to see a citizen that prioritizes the first. But why that should be a trade-off? I mean, it seems that there is a tension between the egalitarian and the liberal dimension here. And I ask myself if this assumption is warranted. Because historically, also, the expansion of liberal democracy has often been driven by a demand for redistribution, an egalitarian demand, you know. It's all the story of democratization in Europe, you know, due to enfranchisement of workers, you know, development of welfare states, broadening of substantive equality. So this dimension in the book seems to be very much in tension between them, but I don't think it's always the case, you know. It might be the case in Poland because, you know, there's a specific, you know, partisan difference, but this might not be a general trend, you know, that you should have liberal against egalitarian understanding of democracy. Question number 3. You have 5 categories, you know, the strong liberal Democrats, weak liberal Democrats, indifferent, and so on. So my question is, who are really these people populating these categories? Because there is specifically, there is one category, the weak liberal Democrats, that is very large in your analysis, and this category basically represents the relative majority of respondents in both countries, Poland and Hungary. And this raises a critical question to me. Are these coherent types, or are they artificially created and, you know, by aggregating diverse group with different orientation also? Because it seems to me that there are several pieces of evidence that push me toward the latter. First, for example, the weak liberal Democrats is showing some odd demographic characteristic. Basically, older respondents, males, university graduates, and those enjoying comfortable financial situation are more likely to belong to this group. But this group is also characterized by a strong emphasis on redistributive benefits, which you might think it's more associated with financial difficulties, not this clear category, you know. So it seems that there is a, you know, demographic attitudinal mismatch, and, you know, one reason is that there might be different groups populating this category actually at the end. And there's also, you know, a partisan difference, you know, in this category, especially in Poland, because you have, you know, voters of peace voters that are strongly, you know, towards redistribution, and civic platform more liberal ones, which is at odds with, you know, their liberal understanding also of democracy. And also, you note in chapter 4 that weak liberal Democrats have a very high evaluation of liberal democracy, even if they emphasize egalitarian and redistribution. And so I ask myself whether these citizens are really weak liberal Democrats, you know, or maybe they simply combine a liberal and a redistributive, you know, orientation in a way that the measurement model treats these as basically incompatible. Question number 4. How do you account for change and time in your analysis? Because I think, so chapter 5 is a very good one, and I like, you know, how you basically provide an analysis of how autocratizing elite frame democracy. And you identify 2 rhetorical strategies. So emphasizing democratic failures to deliver outcomes and proposing majoritarian alternatives that reject institutional constraint. And I think this is an important work that show that backsliding elites actively appeal to this kind of non-liberal understanding. But the feeling is that the analysis is, and it's perfectly fine because, that there's some limitation, but the analysis is static instead of being dynamic in a way, if you know what I mean. And you acknowledge whether elected leaders reshape citizens' view of democracy or whether they simply echo understanding already present in the electorate. This remain an open question. These are your words. So next project, maybe, like kind of temporal analysis to show how elite rhetorics evolve over time, whether this rhetoric shifts in response to backsliding opportunities, or whether it precedes or it follows change in public opinion. That will be, great to see, the causal effect, the cause effect. Also to assess the causal direction between elite and citizens. And this goes basically to the heart of the book argument about citizen commitment. Because actually, if elite are primarily echoing, pre-existent preferences in the citizens, then it's true that weak democratic commitment constrain democratic resilience. But if the elite are actively reshaping how citizens understand democracy, then the locus of agency lies, within the elite and not within the citizens, okay? Question number 5, and then I'm gonna conclude. So, chapter 6, there's a very counterintuitive, findings about culture. And so my question is, what if this is all about culture at the end of the day, and not about liberal commitment to liberal democracy? Because that's, it's also fascinating because, the findings in chapter 6 partially contradict your theoretical expectation. And I think this is great also for a book, this is very honest the way you show and discuss these results. But what does emerge as a powerful predictor also of backsliding is not partisan affiliation or normative differences in how democracy is defined, but cultural orientation. And this, to me, suggests an alternative explanation. Basically, what appears as tolerance for democratic backsliding is actually voters prioritizing cultural conservatism over procedural democracy. So it might be that the real story of your book is not about abstract democratic commitment, but about concrete cultural conflict at the end of the day. And voters may not have weak liberal democratic commitment in the abstract, but they might be willing to accept some institutional changes that constrain cultural progressives, in order to advance culturally conservative goals. And that's it. This would make backsliding contingent of the emergence of salient, cultural cleavages, rather than pre-existing level of liberal commitment or so on. So this might be the story. And I think that's already something. But I have a bonus question. But before, I should really tell, this is a great book. This is, in the literature on backsliding, autocratization, this is a crucial, contribution to the study of these processes today. And there are a lot of questions, that's normal. But and it's also very nice to read the final chapter of the book, the conclusion, where you open up a lot of other avenues for research, that can refine, extend, or maybe test on other cases, as you show the finding of the book. So this is great. I probably left the most important question at the end, but I guess this, as I said at the beginning, this might be the question for your next book, and that's the following one. So if strong liberal commitment is crucial to avoid backsliding, democratic backsliding, and in general, is crucial for democratic resilience, and if this is also, as you show, this is exogenous to elite agency in a way, so the big question here is, where does liberal democratic commitment come from? So is it the product of what exactly? Education, institutional experience, historical legacy, economic outputs, political socialization, and so on. So where it does come from? So it can be up in the air, So that should be something. This brings me to in the direction of maybe a more social grounded theory of democratic backsliding, which is, I think, what is actually missing in the field at the moment. So overall, democratic commitment asks vital question about why democracy proved vulnerable to erosion from within, the role of the elite, the role of the citizens. I invite everyone here in the room to read it and to enjoy the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luca. I don't know, of course, there were lots of questions. Natasha, would you like to answer some of them? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is exactly why one goes on book tours, right? To come away with more ideas for more research, especially now that I have more money to answer all of these questions. That's then extra nice. So I will literally only be able to pick and choose. Actually, I have 4 pages of notes, so I'll really need to pick and choose. But the main point being, thank you for giving this such a close reading. So I really appreciate it. And as I said, a lot of these things I will be able to, not to say I'm aware of all of this, I'll do it all better, but this can really feed into what I'm doing next. Maybe to pick up on definitely the first 2 comments you made. So is weak commitment the cause or an enabling factor? I actually wouldn't claim it's the cause. And it's also not what I say in the book. So it's not why do citizens cause backsliding, it's why do they choose to tolerate it, right? So I do still think fundamentally, of course, backsliding is elite driven. You need to have elites coming into power. And if then citizens fail, so it's a bit of a conjunctural causation. If the vulnerability is there and elites arrive in power and citizens fail to go against them and resist this, then we have backsliding. But why do we have this? When the cross-national evidence would suggest it's not the case, and that's where the whole story about backsliding comes in. But I definitely think democratic commitment is a vulnerability more than a cause of backsliding. For the measurement, actually, that's the big part. So the first work package in the new project will look into how to operationalize this, because the way we measured it for this project, it was, of course, one of the first questions we had to answer, is that what I would now say in hindsight, we over-relied on the existing battery from the World Value Survey, which at the time already felt perhaps not exactly ideal, but at least it had been validated. And I didn't have the confidence at the time to say, I'm going to do this so much better. I have that confidence now, so I will do this so much better in the next time. And I think a lot of the points you raise are going to help with this. The understandings of democracy groups, I think this is another question. I really like the idea, which is in a sense also more methodological. I really like the idea of latent profile analysis because it allows you to bring all of these groups together. But of course, you also give up a lot of control to the algorithm that spits out the groups. And you can go back and forth and look at different groups and what makes sense theoretically and what has the higher statistical indicators and so on. But I'm not absolutely wed to this method going forward. I am wed to the idea that I would like to have a measurement that is multidimensional, because I do think that's an important part that we overlook in existing measures. But I'm also kind of counting on the methodological expertise of the postdocs that will join my team to maybe come up with something that's where you can unpack the black box a little bit more than you can do with latent profile analysis. yeah, I think the other points like change over time, temporal dimension, and also, of course, these cultural orientations. So one of the PhD students that will join the team, that's exactly her argument. And I hesitated. I was like, so do I want to have someone who might dismantle my argument? But then I think that's, of course, the progress of science, right? So maybe it is. So I think there is definitely conflation between how democracy is viewed and the cultural cleavages that exist. And I think the cultural cleavages are, of course, also something that we see emerge in a lot of Western democracies. I want to believe it's not only about that, but I do also find that that is an important dimension. Your bonus question, the reviewers would have liked me to write an entire chapter on where our towards democratic commitment come from. I find it a really fascinating question. I'm not sure it's a question that we can answer, A, from a political science perspective, and B, and I'll say something cynical, with the timelines of grants today. So I think what you would need is a much more longitudinal study looking into how democratic beliefs form in people over time. And then we might have an answer in like 20, 25 years. And by then a lot of other things have shifted, because I do think it's a question of kind of the socialization. And we know we have elements of an answer here, right? So democratic experience, civic education in schools, and so on. But I think knowing this is going to be also really crucial in developing interventions, because of course the big practical implication is, so how do we boost democratic commitment? If it's such a vulnerability, how do we make people believe more? But I don't think you can do that with a television campaign. I actually think you need to start in schools, and you need to start kind of being much more explicit about what democracy is about. And so I think the kind of the empirical design needed for this is very complex, and is something that I think is an absolutely crucial question, but I'm not quite sure, you kind of run a vignette experiment and see this. And I think I'll get at angles of this, so I think that the kind of a sub-question thereof is how stable, how malleable is democratic commitment, but where does it really come from? I'm not sure how to get a proper empirical angle on that, but I agree that it's an important question. Okay, so we can open up.
You can open up the floor for questions, and already a lot of them. Luana, you go first.
Thank you, Natasha. Really a wonderful book. It's the second time I see the presentation, so I enjoyed it even more. I also have, the first question I wanted to ask, Luca asked, so it's fine, and it was about the operationalization of liberal democracy. I actually wonder, you also partially answered to this already, in a lot of the democratic literature, there is a proper dimension that measures electoral democracy. Mm-hmm. So I wonder why you decided not to do that, and why you think, and if you think that actually, that this kind of operationalization without the electoral dimension apart actually influenced your typology that you have here now, right? Because we saw this distribution with the liberal, right? For the method you use, it influenced a bit the distribution. I have another question related to the dimension, and it's why you didn't include, especially considering Poland, a dimension of institutional democracy with a question on separation of powers, right, check and balances, which seems to be such, now in the literature it's so prominent. And the third question, it's about the radical right. So you also showed in the part in which you described the elite, you commented the quote on the Christian party saying, it seems coherent. To be honest, if you take Democrat away from Christian Democrat and you say a Christian party, it is coherent, right? It's a religious-based party, reminds us of many authoritarian regimes that are outside Europe. If you have a religious party, it's an illiberal party by definition. So it's just the word Democrat that doesn't fit in there. But in general, when we think about liberal democracy and commitment to liberal democracy, especially now that you are about to study the, let's say, rest of Europe, here the implicit argument is about the radical right. So, and it is the commitment of radical right voters and elites to liberal democracy the way we understand it. We also see it now happening in US, for example. So I wondered how you, if you plan to explicitly tackle this dimension.
Should we collect or should I answer one by one?
What do you prefer?
I'll try and answer short so that we can say. Yeah, thanks a lot, Luana. So the first thing is I will radically review the item battery, and we now have with a colleague based at Koch University, we're running a panel survey around the upcoming Hungarian elections, and so we already have a first. We had to cobble it together very fast, but a first new version of the item battery where we actually have the free and fair elections as a measure of electoral democracy as a baseline measure. And the liberal dimension we now operationalize with courts overseeing legislation, media freedom, and this kind of civil rights protect you from state oppression. So something that's much closer to, I would say, like a conceptually coherent operationalization of liberal democracy. And then based on that battery, I want to kind of go forward and develop this for the rest of Europe. So institutional democracy will be in there with the separation of powers. The radical right is also in there in the sense that the new project is not so much about democratic backsliding, but about threats to democracy. And of course, radical right parties, liberal parties are threats to democracy. So we chose a variation of countries where we have strong far-right parties, either already in government or moving closer in that direction. And so this will be very much the outcome is no longer so much do we have backsliding or not, but do we have strong voters and what correlates with kind of vote support for them? So this dimension is covered here.
Yes, thank you so much for a lovely presentation. I look forward to reading the book. I very much appreciate your methodological approach, mixed methods. I know from experience that this is really, really difficult. So I'm very happy to see that. And that you did it in 2 countries. So it's quite an accomplishment. I have a question about diversity and how citizens view and evaluate and understand democracy. If we're thinking about backsliding, it's often women and minoritized, ethnically minoritized, sexually minoritized citizens who suffer the most of such a regime change. And I was wondering, you mentioned something that you have women and men, but did you also look intersectionally at what citizens believe? Both countries have a big Roma community. So, yeah, I'll be very interested to hear more about that.
Yeah. I didn't look much into those dimensions, although one of the reasons I would say why we did see electoral turnover in Poland is actually the mobilization of young women. In this case, not so much around democracy, but about the intention to further restrict abortion rights in a country where they were already more restricted than anywhere else in Europe. And so this really led to this backlash of this is enough, and then they turned out to vote. Right. So I think there's something to be said, but the general diversity angle was not the focus here, because I was trying to explore at this kind of the micro foundations of this overarching argument at the citizen level, not looking into individual kind of groups of citizens. But in the new project, we will be looking at different social groups and how they might align with different understandings of democracy and for which reasons. And that could definitely be a dimension to explore further here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your work. Excellent one. My question relates to your main question. You ask why citizens tolerate democratic backsliding. The question is why illiberal democracy elites' arguments resonate with the citizens. You know, and this is a link to the 4th question of Professor, the elite rhetoric. The logos is exactly within the elites. So, what is your conclusion? Why those arguments resonate within people?
It's a great question. So I think I'm not sure I have an answer to the why. What I do think is the case is perhaps so when we have these very broad measures, democracy sounds nice, but we rarely have a very solid and therefore also maybe a very resilient understanding of democracy at the individual citizen level. And so when then elites come in and say, you know, you like democracy, right? But you do realize that democracy is about the elected majority implementing its program, because of course majority rule, it's a very intuitive dimension of democracy. So surely you wouldn't disagree that we remove these judges that are preventing us from implementing the program that we were elected to implement by the majority. So I think cognitively, some of the alternatives to liberal democracy are actually more accessible than the complexity of, so why do we have democracy and the strong will for citizens, but then we also need to constrain the elites institutionally with non-elected actors and so on. So I think there's something to be said about simple explanations. And I think also the rise of populism that we see in Europe is often about simple explanations. We're doing badly economically, people are out of jobs, so what do? Oh, we'll send all the migrants back to where they came from, and suddenly we will all be... And I think to a similar extent, these majoritarian appeals, they mimic this, it's self-evident, right? We have the majority, we do what we want. And I think as long as we don't have a stronger, and this is like, where does the commitment come from and where could it come from, civic education that is more explicit about what is democracy actually about and how do we defend it, it requires a much higher cognitive effort to push back against these simplistic, either anti-immigration or majoritarian designs. So I think that would be my spontaneous answer.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I'm already in chapter 4, and I'm loving the book, and so did the presentation. So thank you very much. I have a question about your next project, so to speak, and more concretely about the democratic backsliding. All right, so this has been a term very much in use post-financial crisis, and it's no coincidence, at least in my opinion, that a lot of what we saw in Hungary and in Poland is 2010 onwards, right? Yep. Now, your book came out in September, and I assume there was a long process of writing it, but in the meantime, even since your book has been published, a lot has changed with democracies, both with consolidated and more fragile democracies in the world. Just last month, the Council and the Parliament have approved an EU deportation bill, which, if we are to talk about backsliding, I think we can look no further than in our own backyards, so to speak. Now, my question is this concept still relevant? Does it capture what is happening in contemporary democracies? Does it do justice as a conceptual framework, as a theoretical framework, to understand what is going on? Thank you.
Thank you. As I said, the new book actually doesn't look at backsliding as the outcome of interest, and I think where backsliding is more limited and why I open it up is that you have this assumption you've achieved a certain degree of democracy, but then you backslide from there. But in a way, it's still a linear logic that you go, all the way from electoral autocracy to liberal democracy, and then on this one line, you slide back or forth, right? And so I think there's something to be said about the situation being somewhat more complex, because you have actors that are on paper liberal democratic implementing actions that are less so. So it's in a way more multidimensional, which is also why I open the outcome variable up much more broadly and say, how relevant. So how can we actually capture liberal democratic commitment, liberal democratic attitudes, and how consequential are they for political behavior, and not so much about concrete democratic backsliding as a concept. So, yeah.
Thank you. Congratulations for your wonderful job. So I appreciate very well the comments as well. I have a very short question. So do you think about extending your work in a kind of a comparative studies with the global south mostly and Africa as well? Because we do have these same issues like changing the constitution, the rules to remain indefinitely in power. So whatever, yeah. It's kind of very controversial about the way democracy works.
And of course, democratic backsliding is very much a global phenomenon. So members of my team have pushed to, so can we have like South Korea? Can we have Latin America? I mean, Bolsonaro would be one of the examples. I'm a little bit reluctant for reasons actually of comparability. So I think it's already going to be a challenge to expand the measurement from Poland and Hungary as these kind of post-communist contexts to all of Europe. And while I think there's a lot to be said about cross-national work, if I now imagine myself developing a battery of citizens' understandings of democracy that holds across the world, I find that quite the challenge. So I think the way I would hope for this to be picked up is for scholars from other world regions be it the global south, be it, I mean, the US, right? There's so much work on the US. I feel like I don't need to add to that all of the American colleagues that would be going crazy about the midterm elections and so on. And to say, I would leave that to country experts, because I'm also, like, my background is more in qualitative work. I feel much more comfortable working in empirical contexts that I'm at least somewhat familiar with. And I wouldn't feel very comfortable working in regions that I know very little about. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Also, to add to the points already about mixed methods design and its challenges, I find it very impressive, as well as the linking between political elites and citizens, which I also found to be very challenging as well. And perhaps on that note, a bit reverting the question that was asked already, namely why appeals of liberal politicians work. The inverse of that, and something I've been more and more interested in, is why appeals of liberal politicians do not work. And on that, my question would have to do with, I mean, both more broadly in like Peter Mayer kind of argument about the hollowing of the center and the liberal democracy and the meaning of it. There was already brought up the recent EU bill dealing with migration. In Eastern European context, there's also work by Krastev and Holmes about the light and failed, and how large part of Law and Justice appeal, I know Polish case better, is that they promise to do something. Like many people had the feeling, I don't even agree, but at least they have some kind of policy. Like they don't want to just drift in this post-history and enjoy themselves, but they have some vision of the state. And on that note, I wanted to ask, in the expansion of your work, do you also, in terms of the matching of political elites and citizens, do you also want to look only at illiberal actors and if their frames resonate? Or perhaps you think, and I understand it's way more work, but do you also like to elucidate this dynamic as well to show what doesn't resonate or like what doesn't land? Because I think that would also make your argument even stronger.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think there's a lot to be said also in response to Luca's question about, is there a tension between liberal and redistributive dimension, that citizens' perception of responsiveness is going to be often tied more to outcomes than to institutions or executive constraints and so on. And so if you come in as a party saying, but we're going to give you redistribution, it becomes a tension because you prioritize this over other things, because you're kind of led to prioritize this. I'm actually thinking more and more that, so the new project focuses primarily on the demand side and not on the supply side, but I'm actually thinking more and more that I need to find someone to pay me more money to because I do think there's a lot to be said about, if the illiberal frames resonate so much, what are the others getting so wrong, right? And some of the work that I've done on the European Parliament actually shows that as the illiberal actors have become more emboldened, at least the mainstream parties have become a little bit more vocal in why is it exactly that we need to go after rule of law, why is this central, what are our values, rather than having this very lofty, because these are our values, yeah, and so on, but why are they our values? Can we stand behind them a little bit more in a little bit of a more convinced way? So, yeah, I will not put this in my future grant proposals folder, and maybe this needs to come sooner rather than later, because I agree it's very much a supply and demand story, but I also didn't want to write a project that wants to do everything all at once. So, but point taken.
Congratulations on the book. It's really a great contribution. We have two questions. One is on your latent profile analysis, and on two profiles that you haven't discussed that much, which are the indifferent and the ambivalent. So let's assume it's not pure straight linings of two kinds, but it's a meaning. I don't really understand how you see the conceptual meaning of those two groups when it comes to democratic resilience. Like, if you're indifferent, does that mean that you're the least likely to stand for democracy? Because basically everything is indifferent, even compared to the majoritarian vision of democracy. So is it an in-between category with two extremes, or is it actually one of the extreme, which is the least committed to democracy because they just don't care? So how do you see that conceptually? And then since your next book is about or next project is about the demand side and having a broader or a more diverse categorization of vision of democracy, I was a bit surprised not to see here, and I don't know whether that's going to be in the project, visions or understanding of democracy that would actually start from the premise that what we have now is no democracy, because democracy means more participation, more co-decision. Coming from Switzerland, I assume that's an issue that came to your mind. So how do you integrate that? And have you seen any of that in, not so much the survey part, but in the focus group part, that some people were saying, actually, okay, election is nice, but that's really not democracy. Democracy is much more participation than that.
Yeah, two really good questions. So the alternative, so the other groups, the indifferent group in particular, this is one of the questions that we actually want to probe as pathways to kind of non-liberal views. So is it about a strong alternative preference? So you're a die-hard majoritarian, you really think this is democracy, and so you're going to vote for the majoritarian candidate? Or is it about indifference and therefore, in this case, disengagement from the system at large, and so you kind of drop the ball, you don't vote, or you vote for radical parties to protest or whatever? And I think both are actually similarly dangerous. And I would actually expect the indifferent pathway to be the much more numerous one, right? So I think you might have some you might even have some diehard authoritarians, but they're not going to be a big part of your population. But you may have, and I think this is what we see very much with this perceived lack of responsiveness and also lack of liberal democracies at the moment to deliver concrete results. That's where you have the openness towards radical parties and towards radical alternatives to say, well, we've given these mainstream parties decades to solve these issues, and they're obviously failing. Here comes someone who's offering me a quick solution. So I think this indifference is a category that I want to unpack much more, also because of, as Luca pointed out, it's such a big category and there might be much more behind it. And indeed, the participatory dimension is something that I want to add to the battery, not so much because it came out in the focus groups, but because it didn't. So we were really pushing them on saying, so which role do you see for citizens? Oh, they need to go to elections. Which other role do you see for citizens? And they would come up with things like, oh, you can go into the streets and pick up waste. You can go to your local like building community, so kind of, I think, like a communist remnant, and like be part of a committee there in your local building. And I thought, surely there's like other stuff you can do. We had explicit questions about protest. Do you think protest is like, do you participate in protest? And some of them actually had participated in protest. That's what we made one of the factors for being in the groups. But across the line, they would say, you know, protests, they don't help, they're useless, they're violent, they're dangerous. I never go there because people, like the police are aggressive or they have anti-protesters and so on. And we even then asked explicitly, what do you think about the legitimacy of protesting against elected leaders? And it was a resounding no. It's like, they have been elected, you have another chance in 4 years' time, you do not go into the streets. Which is, of course, somewhat at odds with what we see in Poland and Hungary, because we do have public demonstrations. But in these focus groups that we had, although people had participated in protests, they really felt this was not an effective means. Now, I do expect that to be different in some of the Western European countries. French, of course, in forms of participation, if you're not in the streets wielding banners. But also, of course, Germany, we had the big demonstrations against the AfD. So I think that will actually be a big difference, and that's why I want to include that as an explicit dimension in the new battery.
Yeah, other questions I was going to ask. Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. Extremely interesting. I had a question about the importance of the cultural dimension and your categories of Democrats. One of which is redistributive, which is outcome oriented. Would you are you in favor of adding an outcome oriented category with the cultural dimension integrated? Because the redistributive is socio-economic. And don't you think that there's also a reading of your majoritarian Democrats that kind of indirectly measures that, because it's the cultural majority that dominates, and so it will deliver on the cultural dimension because it's the cultural majority?
Yeah, that's a great point. So what we've done right now for the new battery in Hungary is we have liberal, majoritarian, redistributive, and then we have what we currently call Hungarian items. And so this is political stability, fight against corruption, and protecting traditional culture. So the question is, it would be, for now, it would be a much less homogeneous category because it's different kinds of outcomes that might skew in one direction or another. So I think this is a discussion to be had within the team. Like, so how can we build a cross-national battery that holds? And I see how the cultural item might go into the majoritarian ones, but I think, if anything, I would want to have really neat categories. And I probably wouldn't want to go beyond 5 different dimensions, because then at one point it just becomes very messy. And if I say, oh, you know, we ran this survey and we see that there are 10 different groups in different countries, and so it's always this compromise between how nuanced can you go and how far does the measure carry. And so I think what we'll be doing is we'll have the cross-national dimension, and then we'll also have like specific items in the country. And in Hungary, very much we're looking at culture. We also have a conjoint in there that speaks about cultural dimensions as one of the facets of a regime. I'm struggling a little bit to see how the outcome dimension, if it conflates very different outcomes, it will be less coherent than the other dimensions, and that would become a real measurement problem. But I think the point on cultural polarization is one of the key drivers. Also, now having a team member wanting to look into this will push us to have maybe actually a separate battery on cultural divides. That's not part of the understandings of democracy battery, but more of an alternative hypothesis. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, perhaps more a suggestion. So you talked about the solution, citizenship education and so forth. Well, in the citizenship education literature, there is also a lot of research on what are the democratic values of children and so forth. And it might be also interesting to look at ICCS, very large surveys that already include a varied number of measures, and to take a bit of inspiration in those survey measures, because that is what you also explained, the different types of how you can be a citizen that relates to that, different values and so forth. So, and that has already been measured several times globally, but also, like you also mentioned, national specific measures. So yeah, it's perhaps an idea to also take that also with you.
And I was actually speaking to someone in Leuven who said in this ICCS they also have underage respondents, right? Which in a lot of these cross-national surveys it's only adults, and I think at that point you already have some view of what democracy is. There's another ERC actually that's about to be started at the CU, Alexander Bohr, and he looks, I think that so it's probably children. It's not even adolescents, into how conceptions of democracy develop. Like, for example, sharing. It's fairer to share than it is to dominate, and so I think there's. I don't know if I'm the person who'll be conducting that research, but I do find that really fascinating research to see where do these beliefs come from. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? No, okay. Then I think we can finish. Thank you so much, Natasha, for this wonderful lecture, and for everybody, of course, and Luca, first of all, for the very interesting comments, and everybody else for their questions. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. This was super helpful.